Thanks. No. All right, good evening, folks. See a lot of familiar faces that I saw last time and a lot of new faces, so welcome back, or thanks for joining us. Just to give a quick synopsis of what this program is intended to do, right? We talked about it last week, but with America turning 250 years old, right, I thought it was time. The Depression will be 100 years old in the coming decade, to kind of do a public lecture series where we dissect the Great Depression, usually going chronologically, right, from the 20s, and we'll end with the Second World War. So last week's, if you missed it, hopefully will be uploaded online in the coming weeks, but we talked about the countryside, and so when you talk about one, you have to talk about the other, so we're going to talk tonight about the cities in the 1920s, right? Two fundamentally different kind of economic situations, right? Last week we talked about the countryside's kind of gripped in this agricultural depression, very bad for farmers, right? The cities are going to experience what many has called the Roaring Twenties, right? And we'll talk about if the Roaring Twenties were truly roaring, and if so, for who, right? So we'll start with this, right? I think a lot of times when I've talked to my students in the past, or just people in general, right, a lot of the fundamental understanding of the 1920s comes from F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby, right? You either read the book in school, or you watched the movie with Leonardo DiCaprio, right? It's this fantastic film where the 1920s seem like the cat's meow, right? Everybody's got fast cars, there's liquor flowing, right? Nightlife galore, okay? And as Scott Fitzgerald publishes this book, in 1925, kind of right in the middle of what will become the Roaring Twenties, right? And today, really, this is where most people get their perception of the 1920s, from The Great Gatsby, from those images of suited men and dressed women, right, dancing the nightlife of New York City. Some of that is true, right? F. Scott Fitzgerald does make some valid points. There is a flow of money, right? There is alcohol, there is cars, all of these things for the first time. But it obscures some of the realities of, what city or urban living was like for everyone, right? So tonight we'll start with the grand overview and then work our way down through kind of political changes that affect the city, demographic changes, and economic changes. So the most important thing to understand the 1920s from the very beginning, right, is a top-down look at what happens to the United States, right? Political historians, political scientists call this the Republican ascendancy, okay? And these three gentlemen are going to control the White House for a combined 12 years, right? Warren G. Harding, an Ohioan, is the first president elected in 1921, followed by his vice president who succeeds him upon his death, Calvin Coolidge, and then finally Herbert Hoover, who takes us into the 1940s, or 30s, excuse me, right? And essentially, these three men, or their kind of political philosophies, can be summed up in pretty easy terms, right? They're fiscally conservative, and they're laissez-faire when it comes to economics, right? They want low taxes, they're pro-business, they want deregulation, right? For Warren G. Harding, in 1921, coming out of the First World War, coming out of that progressive era of massive reforms, think Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson, right? His kind of pitch to the American people is that there must be a return to normalcy, right? The progressive reforms have started witch trials and witch hunts, right? We're looking for social ills in every corner of the country, right? We got dragged into this conflict that Woodrow Wilson pledged that we wouldn't get into. And our economy has suffered for it. He points to the rural countryside, right? Look what's happening to our farmers. It's time for a Republican administration to do that return to normalcy, right? It's very funny, given, if you know anything about Warren G. Harding, right? Normalcy would not be the word I would use to describe Warren G. Harding, right? During his campaign, he's racked with a series of scandals, two being affairs, one where he fathers an illegitimate child and the Republican National Convention locks her away so she can't tell the press, right? The second, he sleeps with a wife of a longtime political ally, and they pay her some hush money, right? Nan Britton, she's the first person to ever successfully blackmail a president, right? That's fun, a little Jeopardy trivia for you. He also, takes part in a little bit of political corruption and drinking himself, right? Teapot Dome is before Watergate in 1974, considered the worst political scandal in American history, right? His Secretary of Interior is doing shady oil dealing business out west in Wyoming. He goes to jail, right? So Warren G. Harding, his, kind of perceived return to normalcy is really kind of an upsetting of the status quo. Unfortunately for Harding, he suffers from a massive heart attack and dies in 1923, and he's succeeded by Calvin Coolidge, his vice president, right? Calvin Coolidge kind of temperamentally not like Warren G. Harding, right? His nickname is Silent Cal. If Warren G. Harding is running around having affairs, extramarital, Warren G. Harding doesn't say much of anything, right? And that kind of sums up his political philosophy, Silent Cal. He doesn't want the federal government to be involved in the economy. He wants to deregulate. He wants to balance budget, right? In 1925, he says that the chief business of the American people is business, right? Put America back to work. Let businesses do what they do best. And so he pursues that deregulation, those tax cuts. And in fact, to give Calvin Coolidge some credit, he does lower the national debt, right? 1923, when he takes over, it's $22 billion. When he leaves the White House in 1929, it's $16 billion, right? So something has occurred, right? We'll talk about next week that too much deregulation, right, sometimes leads to stock market speculation, right? 1929, as he's leaving the White House, the stock market crashes, right? He's also, Silent Cal, right, is silent not only because he's soft-spoken or says little of kind of federal affairs, but he doesn't believe that the federal government should do much. We talked about last week Calvin Coolidge's refusal to kind of bail out farmers with the McNary-Hagan Farm Bill twice, right? He vetoes it. He's also has to be pressured by the national kind of Republican Party to do anything about a massive flooding in the Mississippi River in 1927, right? But Americans are largely in support of this kind of economic activity, this deregulation, these low taxes. And this graph kind of sums it up, right? This is the general understanding of the 1920s. What you're looking at is GNP. It's a little different than GDP, right? We won't go too economic on you. But essentially, how much products are produced by American workers, corporations, and businesses, right? In the 1920s, it skyrockets, right? For the first time since after the war, gross national product is at an all-time high, right? This tax cuts for businesses, the subsidies for the Ford Motor Company, things like that are boosting the American economy. This is what ascends Herbert Hoover into the 12th year, or what will be the 12th year, right, of Republican control of the White House, right? Things are good at the macro scale, right? Nationwide, people are looking to the cities, they're burgeoning, they're excited, they have lots of money, right? This is the, kind of our general understanding. This is a great Gatsby understanding. But what we'll talk about the rest of this lecture is where that understanding kind of falters, right? We'll talk about at the end how there isn't this kind of uniform prosperity, right? Across the board, everyone's not doing well, okay? We talked about it last week. Farmers certainly in the 1920s wouldn't have said it was roaring, right? It was awful. It was a depression. They were gripped in it, all right? So we'll look at the kind of cities and see what political, social, and economic changes kind of affected them. The first big one is Prohibition, the 18th Amendment, right? It is a law that is ratified to the United States Constitution. I'm sure many of you are aware of this. It bans the distribution, sale, or manufacturing of intoxicating liquors, is what they call it, alcohol, right? No one's going to drink in the United States anymore, right? This is that kind of last vestige of those progressive reforms, right? How do we fix society's ills, right? Temperance or prohibition has a long history in America, right? Starting in the 1840s, it was mostly Christian women who led it, who looked to drunken husbands and their kind of abandoned families or battered children, right? And said alcohol is the cause, right? It's known now in history as kind of the noble experiment, right? We know it was a massive flop, but it was, done with the best intentions, right? So Prohibition, kind of sweeps the nation. It's ratified in 1919. It prohibits that distribution, transportation, and manufacturing of liquor. It's supposed to reduce crime, poverty, homelessness, absent fathers, etc., right? Congress has to pass an enforcement wing of this under the Volstead Act, right? How is Congress going to enforce this constitutional amendment? Well, the long and short of it, right, is that they don't. They're not very good at it, okay? A nation of drinkers, right, in the 19th century largely, right, Americans drink way more than we do, right? Barrels and barrels of whiskey a year, right? We're moderate drinkers compared to historic Americans, right? And so it's really a failure. It's a failure to limit that consumption, right? It dropped in the first few years to, 30% of pre-prohibition levels, but just by 1925, it was back to about 60, 70% of Americans were drinking at what they were prior to Prohibition. There were legal loopholes to Prohibition. Right here, you're looking at a medicinal alcohol card, right? I'm sure there's no modern comparisons for something that was once prohibited. Now that so you could go to the doctor for ailments, right? The doctor could determine what alcohol was necessary to remedy. It was about anything, right? Anxiety, back pain, I'm stressed, okay, take some alcohol, right? There's legal loopholes for this. In fact, medicinal alcohol sales jumped up by 400% right after Prohibition. Everybody was sick. Of course, there was also loopholes for religious reasons, right? Catholics, they drink wine in the sacraments. So do our Jewish individuals, right? There was a lot of new rabbis showing up at government offices saying that they needed wine for their congregations, right? So there's legal loopholes to this prohibition. One of the sadder aspects of it, right, is the criminality associated with prohibition. Okay, there's going to be organized crime that we'll talk about on the next slide that fills that kind of vacuum left by the prohibition of alcohol. Right, we'll look at a kind of a very local case of that. It was hard for the federal government to enforce prohibition too because everyone drank. Right, it wasn't like rich people, had a patriotic duty to not drink. No, they were just drinking as much as the average working class individual. So it was hard to enforce. It was hard to crack down upon. It also, importantly, when we're thinking about the Great Depression, right, has massive economic blowback. The United States government loses $11 billion in tax revenue by the prohibition of alcohol by the end of the decade when it's overturned in 1933 by the 21st Amendment, right? $240 billion that's equivalent today. The United States government, poof, gone. It cost them $300 million to try to enforce prohibition, right? $6 billion to try to fight it, and they lost $11 billion, right? And the math's not really adding up. And so this is going to be one of the major reasons when the country is onset in a Great Depression of, well, we need the tax revenue, let them drink, right? So when we're talking about enforcement, right, we can look very locally to see some of these ills, okay? If you haven't, I strongly recommend you read the book Prohibition's Proving Grounds. It's published by the University of Toledo Press by a BGSU alumnus from our history department, right? He writes this fantastic book, and he looks at the Toledo, Detroit, Windsor corridor, this kind of on Dixie Highway, right? Canada doesn't have prohibition. They have alcohol. And luckily for Ohioans, there's a lake that connects our borders, right? And so there's a lot of rum running down from Canada, right? And one of the ways that the Volstead Act or federal and state authorities try to fight prohibition is we've got a kind of surplus of World War I vehicles, and we're not in a war. Well, just bring them back to the home front, and we'll use it to stop rum runners, right? Here, used all up and down Dixie Highway and Wood, Lucas, and the southwestern counties of Michigan, right? They called it Little Bertha, right? It's an armored vehicle used in World War I. What they would do is they would drive this behind you on Dixie Highway. If they suspected you of rum running, they would just ram you with it, right? Insane, right? They would also, on Dixie Highway, okay, you're coming down in your Model T. Well, it looks like you might be rumming. Well, we'll just drop a log in front of your car. That'll stop you. You can't escape that, right? Many times this was just regular average Joe people driving Dixie Highway that were caught up, accused of rum running. No evidence to suggest otherwise, right? It's this pressure from the federal and state governments to crack down on all that illegal alcohol coming out of Canada. But again, good intentions, right? Bad execution. Additionally, right, throughout Prohibition, about 1,000 people die annually from drinking tainted alcohol. People don't just stop drinking alcohol because it's now illegal, right? My home county, where I'm from, in Hardin County, just an hour south of here, you can actually walk around the city's grave, cemetery, right, and tap on the graves, and some of them are hollow, right? And they would slip the bottles of whiskey in the back. Somebody would walk, leave the cash, right? There was an exchange, right? Alcohol is flowing everywhere. Most of it, they called it, they were doing it in their bathtubs, backyard stills, right? And so there's alcohol flowing, but it is killing individuals because there's no regulation on how it's being produced. Organized crime, as we talk about, right? The gangs out of Chicago and New York and Youngstown kind of grow in their kind of organization. And they're also going to flood the courthouses across the country. Right? All these people getting arrested for rum running, well, the judicial system's not set up to handle these cases. Courtrooms in Ohio, across the country, are flowing with individuals. What does the court decide to do? We'll let them enter what is kind of new parlance in the day, a plea bargain. Take a plea, go. That becomes kind of general practice during Prohibition. How do you move massive amounts of cases through the court system? People take plea bargains, right? That's kind of a lasting legacy from Prohibition. And so really in total, right, this is the first big political change of the 1920s, right? Alcohol is illegal. We know it's not working. It's a total failure, right? The government's losing money. People are dying. Organized crime is flourishing, right? And people are still drinking. The noble experiment, right, it fails. Go to the next one here, maybe. Okay. The next kind of big sweeping change, right, if you're familiar with your 1920s history, is that women, for the first time in American history, are going to get the right to vote, right? Again, like Prohibition or temperance, there's a long history of kind of women demanding the right to vote, dating back to the 1840s, right? But it takes 70 years until the 19-teens and 1920s for this to become kind of a standard opinion across the political parties, right? Both Democratic and Republican. And much of it, kind of dates back to that World War I service, right? When men go off to war, someone's got to fill the gaps. Women in the cities go to work, right? They go to the factories, right? Think World War II, Rosie the Riveter. This is prior to that, right? They're filling that industrial need of men being gone. And so when the men finally do come back, right, the women say, we fulfilled a patriotic duty. We sacrificed for country. Why don't I get the right to vote, right? You go off to war, I take your place, we all help our country, we all won the First World War, right? Now it's time that I kind of get my fair share. And so they do this throughout the 19-teens and 1920s. This one, this cartoon right here, right, in a political cartoon, is appealing to that sentiment, right? Women served in World War I, but they served before that, right? In home, in factory, in labor, right? Women have always been a part of the American story. They target states first, Kansas, Montana, California. All the 1910s give women the right to vote, right? Montana sends the first woman representative to the House of Representatives. She's the only one to vote against the First and Second World War, mind you, as well. She was a noted pacifist. They're going to utilize wealthy women's connections to their husbands, right, to kind of do a grassroots campaign with the Hoovers and the Hardings of the world, right? Working class women are going to picket on the streets and demanding this kind of a role in society. And it is going to come, right? The 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution, ratified in 1920, says that women have the right to vote in elections, right? So the election of 1920, that election where Warren G. Harding runs, right, is going to see mass women participation. 23 million American women are going to vote for the first time in the 1920 election, right? This is going to have a lot of effects. Well, the first one is that both parties are all going to suddenly say, yeah, we always wanted women to vote. That's why you should join the Republican Party. That's why you should join the Democratic Party, right? We want your vote. And so women are going to take that kind of active participation, that role in both Democratic, Republican politics, but also state, local elections as well. National organizations, right, are also going to push that now we have the right to vote, but women should also be excluded from sex-based discrimination, right? We can vote. We should get paid the same in the workplace, so on and so forth, right? The Equal Rights Amendment 1923, it fails ultimately, right? Men in Congress weren't too ready, right? We just gave you the right to vote, and now you're asking for equal pay. That was a bridge too far for some of them, right? But it fails, but it kind of sets this grassroots motion, the effort into motion, right? That women are going to participate in elections. They handed you prohibition, right? It was a women-led movement. They have the right to vote. They are going to be able to sway those elections, right? And so those are two kind of big national changes, right? You have the prohibition of alcohol. Women now have the right to vote, right? That's a big change on a, kind of a nationwide level, right? It upsets kind of those traditional norms that had been established since the founding in 1776. But beyond these kind of political changes, especially women, right, they're going to kind of demand an increased place in kind of cultural and social affairs as well. This picture here from the Saturday Evening Post kind of represents the best that I can see without actually having pictures, right, of the flappers, right, if you're familiar, of the 1920s. Women who wore their hair short, wore makeup, smoked cigarettes, wore short dresses. And it's embodied in this, what they called the New Woman movement, right? We have the right to vote. Now we want to be equal participants in society, right? I want to smoke cigarettes, which is taboo. I want to drink, right? I want to have, engage in these kind of activities. And they're going to challenge those kind of traditional understandings, right? Men as the household heads of households, right? They pay the bills, they work the job, right? They take care of the family. Women are the homemakers, right? Child rearing, home care, child care, all of those things, right? The flappers of the 1920s are going to say, no thanks, right? And so they're going to change the culture, right, in the cities. This is where that idea, right, if we're thinking back to the Great Gatsby of the parties and the women and the cars, right, they're going to want to participate in that. They have access to entertainment for the first time, right? In the countryside, there's no movie theaters, there's no opera, there's none of that, right? But in the cities, places like New York and Boston and Chicago and Detroit and Toledo, right, these things are going to prop up. Women are going to go in massive droves to the movie theater, to the speakeasies, right, that are propping up all across the country. We'll talk a little bit later about automobiles as well, right? Women are going to start driving. They're going to express this newfound freedom as well, kind of socially, right? They're going to vote, right? A kind of radical proposition. They're going to take birth control for the first time, and they're going to smoke cigarettes, and they're going to drink. And one of the kind of interesting points of this is that there is going to be some backlash to this as well, right? All of a sudden, women are showing their, well, not ankles, but knees at this point, right? There's going to be a pushback to these newfound freedoms, right? The biggest being modesty laws, okay? This is that reaction to the flapper woman. And the most prevalent cases are at beaches or swimming pools or so on and so forth. This one taken in Washington, D.C., an officer of the law is enforcing the 6-inch rule, right? Nothing 6 inches above the knee, all right? And if you were found in violation, it was usually a fine, right? In places in Virginia, right, the backlash got so severe that the Virginia House of Commons tried to limit how much a neck you could show if you were wearing a gown for a dress, right? They didn't want it, on a man it would be the Adam's apple, right? No higher, no lower than that, right? Too salacious, too scandalous, right? And so we see, right, they get the right to vote, they're challenging some of these social norms, there's still going to be issues for women's participation in the Roaring Twenties, right? Those who are working, right, the wealthy women have, at this point hadn't worked much, still didn't work, but immigrant women, right, from Eastern and Southern Europe are working, and they're doing low-pay work for low-pay jobs, right? They're still not equaling out to Italian men, right? If you're an Italian woman, you're making less than your husband who's an Italian man. Same status, right? They don't have that social mobility, right? There is no upward mobility for women. And so that's an issue, right, that they're going to try to fight throughout the 1920s. There's also this question of rural versus urban women, right? We talked about the countryside last week. None of this is happening in the countryside, right? Farm women are doing the same thing that farm women have always done, getting up, caring for the children, caring for the chickens, things of that nature, right? So this conception of modesty laws, it means nothing to the farm folk of this country, right? It doesn't apply. There's also going to be, of course, the double standards, the discrimination, right? Men, it's fun to drink, it's fun to smoke, it's fun to drive fast in the 20s. Women, and we're not going to go there, right? That's just something that we can't do, right? And so this is one of the other upsets, right? Women get the right to vote. They're going to challenge some of these things that are happening in American society. There's also going to be other changes, right, to American society through the 20s that kind of show us that this roaring nature maybe is kind of fracturing at its edges. The biggest being immigration, right? There's going to be a series of kind of immigration laws passed in the 1920s to restrict immigration. Before that, between 1890 and 1920, right, 25 million Europeans stream into the United States. Most of those at the tail end between 1910 and 1915 being Italians, Russians, Eastern Europeans, right? This is different than the earlier waves of migration into the United States, right? Think right after the founding, through the American Civil War, and a little bit afterwards, right? It's the British, it's Anglo-Saxons, it's Germans, things of that nature, right? They're okay, right? But this new wave, Polish immigrants, Italian immigrants, right? They're Catholic. Oof, right? Oof, right? They're Catholic. And in many cases, right, the Russians, they're Jewish individuals, right? And so this kind of upsets the status quo. An interesting point about this, right, is that industrial basis, right? We saw the graph of industrial productivity goes way up. That's based on factory production, right? Gross national production. Most of these individuals are working in those factories, right? At Henry Ford's factory, we'll talk about it, right? There in the 1920s, it's recorded that there's 50 nationalities and 120 languages being spoken in Detroit at the Ford factory, right? And so most of these individuals are working in those kind of low-paying, industrialized, laborious jobs, right? And they're also forming, kind of an old word, ethnic enclaves, right? If you go to New York City, right, Little Italy, right? These individuals, they speak Italian, they're Catholic, right? They're living amongst each other, right? And so this poses a problem for big cities, right? We don't have enough housing. They're creating these tenement housing where we're taking a normal-sized apartment and making it 4 rooms, right? 12 people living in each, big families, right? And it becomes an issue. And so under Harding and then Coolidge, right, we're going to try to reduce the amount of immigration, right? We have all this productivity, but we're slowly starting to run out of good paying jobs, right? Americans are becoming increasingly worried about what happens if there's this tidal wave of Southern European immigration, right? What happens to us? And so in 1921, the Immigration Quota Act is passed, right? It limits immigration of a certain ethnicity, say we'll use Italian for this instance, right, to 2% of what it was in 1910, right? So however many Italians were living in the country in 1910, 2% of that can come in now, right? Or 3%, excuse me. That's what this graphic is representing, okay? But that wasn't severe enough, and so in 1924, Calvin Coolidge says, we'll lower it to 2%, and then we'll push back the census data to 1890, right, when there weren't that many Italians, there weren't that many Russians, there weren't that many individuals, right? We'll keep in the flow of Germanic people, right, settling in the Midwest, Nordic individuals, right, Eastern or Western Europeans, the French, if you're French, come on over, right, if you're British, come on over, but we're going to try to limit that immigration. It's pretty successful as a kind of national policy, right? For Coolidge, it's going to be one of his crown jewels, right? You can see the kind of total decrease of immigrants coming from the south and eastern parts of Europe into the country. But we also talked about last week that for the first time, right, more people lived in the American cities than they did in the American countryside, right? And so one part of that, right, is that more people are flowing into the cities, right? Through Ellis Island, we're getting all of this new immigrant populations from Europe. But domestically or internally, right, the countryside is losing individuals, particularly from the rural South, in what's called the Great Migration, right? 6 million African Americans leave after the Civil War, the rural South to the urbanized North, right? Essentially, right, if you know anything about Southern history, they're escaping some of that kind of Jim Crow racial violence that exists after the Confederacy's defeat in 1865, right? Many of them are going to settle in places like New York City in a place called Harlem, right? A district within one of the boroughs, right, where they're going to focus on the arts and kind of a renaissance like the Europeans, right, of black culture, black music, right? The most important development of which, right, becomes America's crown jewel through the end of the Cold War is jazz music, right? Jazz, really important history. I could give a whole lecture on that, right? I'm not a big fan of jazz myself, but I understand its importance, right? Becomes kind of this uniquely American music, right, that's going to, Louis Armstrong, right, is going to tour all over the world, right, during the Cold War, going to be very important for the United States. That starts here in the Harlem Renaissance. Individuals leaving the countryside, going to the cities, right, taking part in that prosperity, that growing gross national product. We'll talk about in the next couple slides, right? What's the allure of leaving the countryside? Well, it's vacuum cleaners, it's refrigerators, it's things of that nature, right? They're leaving the rural South, they're coming to the urban North, right, to participate in this new kind of economy. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about the political and cultural things. Now let's get into the economics of it, right? The biggest and most important part of the 1920s, right, is going to be these factories. This is a picture from the assembly floor of Ford factory in the 1920s, right? Ford is going to kind of totally flip industrialized labor on its head, right? He's going to take some ideas of other individuals and apply them in a mass scale, right, the assembly line, okay? Before Ford does this, right, it takes on average 12 days to manufacture a car, 12 days. When Ford implements his assembly line in places up in Michigan, right, it's limited to 2 hours, right, 12 days to 2 hours. He can mass produce these cars at an exponential scale, right? Ford also wants individuals to be paid well, right? He thinks that if you're going to make cars fast, you have to have good labor, and so we're going to pay individuals about $5 a day to work in the Ford factory, which there is incredible wages, right? 10,000 men show up outside the Ford factory after Ford announces that they'll be paid $5 a day, right? And his effects are pretty, they speak for themselves, right? In 1920, about 20% of households had a car. 1929, it's 60%, right? A jump of 40% in just 9 years, right? 7.5 million cars in 1920. There's going to be 23 million cars in 1929, right? And so Ford is kind of reinventing the American economy. He's molding it so the people that were his idea, right? The people who work at Ford should be able to afford a Ford truck, right? The thing that they produce, they should also be able to buy, right? And because of that, right, most of the Fords produced on the assembly line are cheap and affordable, right? The average price of a Ford Model T, $250, right? The caveat being is that we're now going to offer people the ability to buy these cars on credit, right? Buy now, pay later. It's going to start with the automobile industry, and as we'll see, it'll trickle down into every facet of kind of American consumption, right? One of the points of this lecture, we're talking about credit, right? Consumption, these two go hand in hand. We've already talked about the change, but these are the most important when we think about the Great Depression, right? Cars are now affordable, $250 to buy a Model T, but you can buy it on credit, as this advertisement is kind of featuring, right? They give you a coupon for a car at the bottom, right? A coupon for a car. Yeah, exactly. Right? 50% of all cars by the middle of the 20s are going to be bought on credit. So of those $23 million or 23 million cars registered in 1929, 50%, half of all of them, right, are not purchased, right? They're bought on a credit line. This, of course, is going to extend, right? Business owners see this and say, well, there is a new burgeoning population of people in the American cities, right? The American city, the urban centers, right, are now where everybody lives. They have all of these new modern conveniences, but in 1920 can't afford them. We're going to offer credit for everything now, right? Ford revolutionized it. We're now going to apply it to household objects, right? 75% of all radios by the end of 1929 on credit. 60% of all furniture on credit, right? 70% of all Americans are going to be on an installment plan for something, whether it's a car, whether it's furniture, whether it's a radio, refrigerators, right? 70% of the country is on an installment plan. Buy now, pay later becomes the kind of theory of the day, right? The American economy is doing well. We're out of World War I. Our cities are flourishing. There's new jazz music. Women are wearing dresses 7 inches above the knee. I mean, holy shit, we got everything, right? We're going to, it's never going to end, right? So, you know, what's the worry about having things on credit, right? I'm sure it's a Great Depression lecture series. Your mind kind of goes to this is going to become a problem very soon, right? Not only are these kind of modern conveniences, they would call them in the 20s, right? Refrigerators for the first time, washing machines, vacuums, bought on credit. But for the first time, the American cities are going to be electrified, right, have electricity at a rapid pace, okay? This is the amount of energy consumption in the United States, right? You don't need to be a mathematician to understand that the graph goes up, way up, right? And so for the first time, right, if you want access to electricity, you have to go to the cities, right? Red line is the electrification of the countryside. The blue line is the electrification of the city, right? Farmers and people living out in the middle of nowhere, right, don't have access to this electricity, but they do in the cities, right, at a massive kind of rate, right? This is adding to that fleeing of the countryside into places like New York and Chicago, right? After World War I, right, why, if my dad's a farmer, I just fought in Paris, do I want to go back to the countryside? No, I'm going to New York City, right? There's cars, there's speakeasies, there's electricity, right? And I can buy my car on an installment plan and my refrigerator and my vacuum cleaner, right? Buy now, pay later, okay? And so this has, all of this, right? The political change, the cultural change, the economic change is all going to have massive effects on the American psyche, right? I'm sure none of us are used to Americans ever arguing, right? But in the 1920s, by the mid-1920s, right, Americans are going to start arguing pretty effectively and all over the country, right? And the biggest example of this, right, is in 1925, right, the Scoops monkey trial. Anybody familiar with the Scoops monkey trial? A few of you, right? What it is, in short, right, is an argument in court over the teaching of the theory of evolution, right? A teacher in Tennessee teaches evolution. The government says that's illegal, right? They get into a big battle. William Jennings Bryan is arguing for the state, right? And then the ACLU is arguing for the teacher, right? Don't really even need to know the specifics of the case, right? You could do a whole lecture on that. What you do need to know is that this is the first time that there's going to be open litigation of all this change in the United States. This is what the Scoops monkey trial comes to embody. That some parts of the country, like in the countryside, are looking at all this massive change going on to the city and saying it's coming too hard, too fast, right? And the cities are going, no, it's not coming hard or fast enough, right? And so you see that when you look back at the electricity graph, right? The countryside, it looks no different than the 1890s, but the cities are going to be at their pinnacle, right? Things are new, things are exciting. There's a rupture happening between Americans, right? 51% live in the cities, 49% live in the countryside. They don't live in the same worlds, right? For the first time in American history, everything is different, right? This is what this comes to embody. So when we're walking into the eve of the Great Depression, right, where the cities own everything on payment plans, and so do the farmers, because now they have all these loans from World War I, their kind of expansion that they have to pay, right? Not only do we have all this economic activity, which is bad, right? 70% of American households being on installment plans, right? When the Great Depression hits, it's going to decimate, right? 2/3 of American farmers operating at a loss by the end of the 1920s, right? What happens when the whole global economy goes kaput, right? These people are going to go with it too, right? What's going to be interesting, and we'll look through it in the 30s, is that a lot of this is going to become, kind of a back channel, right? These debates that we're having in the 1920s, we're all going to recognize that, okay, we're in this together, right? This is a national depression. Some of the other lecture series will look at where those fractures kind of reappear again, where people have different ideas of where FDR should go, right? But by and large, right, the 1920s, these kind of two different worlds are going to be, for better or worse, kind of equalized by the Great Depression, right? That growing gap between the city and the countryside, right, the global economy is going to say, rubber band them kind of back together, right? That you're all in this, you're all suffering together. All right, so why the Roaring Twenties, right? Why take us, time to kind of examine what the cities were like, right? We looked at the countryside, we're now looking at the cities. Why? Well, we know that for some, right, the Roaring Twenties were roaring, right? Most importantly, the top 5% of individuals in the United States were making 30% of all the income, all right? Andrew Mellon, Rockefeller, Carnegie, right? All these individuals, the Roaring Twenties were roaring. Henry Ford, it was roaring, right? We're making lots and lots of money. But they're taking, essentially, the 70% is cut up on the rest of it. 95% are sharing that 70% of the wealth. Top 5 are sharing the 30, right? There's going to be widespread kind of trouble for working families, right? We talked about those installment plans. 70% of all Americans on one in the cities by the end of the decade. Well, across the board, household debt's going to rise from 15% to 35%, right? Debt's going up. Wages are going up a little, right? Now we're on the eve of the Great Depression. Next week we'll talk about the stock market crash and the first couple years of the Great Depression, right? Nobody had the foresight to see that a depression was coming, right? But all of this background noise, right, is hinting that something's going wrong, right? When Americans aren't buying things outright and they're buying it on installment plans, when 2/3 of your farmers aren't making income, right? Things are fracturing at a kind of a surface level, right? And it's going to kind of open wide. But what's important for all of this, right, when you think of the Roaring Twenties or you hear someone talking about the Roaring Twenties, is you have to remember that there was no universal prosperity, right? Things were different for different people, okay? That's why I compliment the countryside with the city. For the countryside, things were really bad, right, on an overall outlook, right? For the city, things were really good, right? But there is none of that universal, right? We see that the immigrants who get, Italians and Polish and Russians, right, are kind of suffering in the cities. While the city's doing good, certain segments of them are not doing good, right? Women are getting the right to vote and expressing new freedoms. Rural women, nothing changes, right? So there is no universality in any of this, okay? But why then, right, is this enduring question? Why do we call the Roaring Twenties the Roaring Twenties, right? It's nostalgia. World War I happens, right? Then things get good in the cities in the 20s. Then you're smacked with the Great Depression in World War II, right? So when we look back, no kidding, the 20s look like they're roaring, right? You're not in a global economic crisis. You're not having to fight Nazis and the Imperial Japanese, right? We're coming out of the trenches of Belgium. Anything looks better than that in the 1920s, right? But, one of the evident truths of history, right, is that nostalgia kind of blinds us to some of those realities, okay? That's universal across the board, right? Is that the 20s look good in comparison to everything that comes after and the thing that comes before, right? And so I hope that through, looking at the 20s first, we're not necessarily into the Great Depression yet, which we will be in March, that we get a better sense of what the United States looked like in that decade before, right? I said the first week, nothing in history occurs in a vacuum, right? Things don't just prop up. It's a culmination of events, right? And so the city is having its struggles. The countryside is really having its struggles. And all of that is going to culminate in the stock market crash of 1929, which we'll address in March. All right, well, that is the presentation on the 20s. I will take any questions you all have, and I thank you very much for coming tonight.